Hello and welcome to the NeoSystems CMMC Town Hall. Now I'd like to introduce your host, Ed Bassett from NeoSystems. Ed?
Hi, thanks, Don, and welcome everybody to our continuing series of Town Hall Ask Me Anything sessions. This has been a series focused on cybersecurity maturity model certification. You might have noticed the last couple of sessions, we've taken a little more broader worldview than just CMMC. And so we may be doing a little more of that in the future as we started seeing a lot of things impacting the global landscape of cybersecurity besides CMMC, big enforcement effort there, but not the only game in town. So keep an eye out for maybe a broader agenda as we go forward. Guest today is Michael McLaughlin. Also, Wade Forbes, you see on the screen, is sketchnoting this, and we'll send that out to folks after the session is over. I do want to mention at the start that we are recording these sessions as part of our community outreach to the defense industrial base. Our focus at NeoSystems as a managed service provider is on organizations that are seeking certification under CMMC, and that's primarily who we have in our audience here today. If you are in the audience and you have some questions for Michael, please drop those in the Q&A feature within Zoom, and I'll try to work those into the conversation as much as I can in the 30 minutes we have today. I'll start with introduction of Michael McLaughlin. Lieutenant Commander McLaughlin is Chief Counterintelligence and Human Intelligence within U.S. Cyber Command's Cyber National Mission Force at Fort Meade. He has held various positions within the U.S. Cyber Command. He graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy and is currently a JD candidate at the University of Maryland. Mike's background is in military intelligence, counterintelligence, specifically within the cyber domain. Do want to put in a disclaimer that Mike is talking with us today in a personal capacity, and the views he expresses are not necessarily representing those of U.S. Cyber Command or the Department of Defense. With that disclaimer, well, Michael, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Ed.
So a couple of weeks ago, CISA put out guidance they called Shields Up, and it was advising all organizations to adopt a heightened security posture, really in response to expected threats from Russia, given their recent aggression. This guidance is broad-based. It intends to get companies of all sizes to be more vigilant on the cyber front. A lot of their advice focuses around incident response, incident reporting. What's your take on Shields Up and what that's all about and what it means to us?
Yeah, so I'm a big proponent of Shields Up. Now, I'm gonna caveat this by saying I think we're really in an inflection point and a transition period in the way in which we address cybersecurity as a nation. And I know a lot of times we talk about the DIB, but really cybersecurity is a national security issue, and it covers everything from critical infrastructure of all sorts, as well as the defense industrial base, and certainly the military and the Department of Defense. Currently, the private sector is responsible for unilaterally defending their own networks. The government's role in that is to provide guidance. A lot of what the CMMC is providing that is ensuring that the NIST guidance and the special publication is being adhered to. In light of all that, it would behoove all organizations to treat CISA's Shield Up as really what it is. It's guidance, but it's also an alert, and it's a tool. It's something to make the private sector very aware of what's going on in the world and how it's going to impact them. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a significant event that really has potential to spill out either unintentionally or intentionally. That kind of depends on Russian leadership at this point. But that could spill out. It could affect networks and companies, certainly outside of Ukraine. Simply put, CISA's guidance it's a blanket recommendation for organizations to be at a heightened posture when it comes to cybersecurity and protecting their critical assets. The guidance itself really emphasizes cybersecurity best practices and how do you implement the proper security framework, irrespective of the external threat. But the external threat certainly adds a level of complexity and really adds urgency at this specific time.
Let's talk about the threat a little bit. So what are we seeing from Russia in terms of their use of cyber warfare against Ukraine in this campaign? Are they doing that in conjunction with traditional military action? What are we seeing out there?
Well, I think you can understand. I'm going to avoid discussing certain ongoing activity for various sensitivity reasons. But I can talk a little bit about what has occurred ahead of the invasion, and specifically what things that we haven't seen yet, just very broadly. So back in, it was almost 2 weeks ago at this point, in late February, Ukrainian banks and government organizations, their websites and their services went down as a result of attacks that has since been attributed to Russian actors. At that time, there were DDoS attacks. There was a new wiper variant that was deployed against various Ukrainian government agencies. And while these activities were benign and designed, it appears to be specifically designed not to spill out of Ukraine, it certainly portends what could potentially happen. In 2015, we saw Russia demonstrate the capability to turn out the lights in Ukraine and deny 230,000 Ukrainians power at, right before Christmas. 2017, we had NotPetya, which spilled out and caused a significant amount of damage. Ultimately, I think Russia has the ability, and they have the demonstrated willingness to conduct these types of attacks. They're not going to be limited to the conflict zone. It's just we haven't seen that yet, but it really behooves everyone to be prepared for that as an eventuality.
Let me ask you about that spillover. So CISA, in the Shields Up guidance, they sort of imply that they believe it could spill over from the Ukraine to the United States and maybe others, but they also mentioned there's no specific or credible threat. So they put that, kind of disclaimer in there. But we're certainly poking the bear pretty hard. We're taking unprecedented economic sanctions, other actions, supporting Ukraine militarily. So, there was already malicious activity sort of against the United States attributed to Russia and Russia-supported actors prior to this campaign, this war. Do you expect this to be inside our borders in terms of the cyber aspect of it? I mean, maybe not the physical aspect, but the cyber aspect.
Yeah, and really, that's the $1 million question. I think it's up to the Russians. Ultimately, that's where it's going to reside, is whether or not the Russian leadership deems that escalation in cyberspace is warranted based on activities that we as a whole of government are conducting. I said we're at an inflection point. I truly do believe that. We're at an inflection point, though, where President Putin is really in the driver's seat. He can choose to limit the negative impact against Russia with respect to what the international community is imposing against them, or he can take a very firm stance and continue along the path that he's chosen. If he chooses the latter, I think Russia's demonstrated history, NotPetya just being one of them, it really indicates that cyber warfare will be at least a weapon of choice that the Russians implement and use. With that in mind, I think it really does behoove everyone to be aware that it is a risk, and to continue to monitor what are the types of things that the U.S. is doing, and what are the ways in which this administration, the U.S., also the international community, are seeking to de-escalate the situation in such a way that we're providing the Russians and Russian leadership with off-ramps that aren't going to lead to malicious targeting of critical infrastructure or use of kinetic weapons outside of Ukraine.
And yeah, interesting to whether this escalates or de-escalates, right? And what we might try to do to influence that. There's an article I read on The Economist last week, I think, that the headline was "Cyber attacks on Ukraine are conspicuous by their absence." And they were kind of taking the position that at least in their investigative reporting, Russia hasn't really broken out the big guns of their cyber arsenal in this current conflict, right? So things like you mentioned, NotPetya, and the utilities, the power attack. That what they've seen so far, the websites you mentioned in this campaign have really been sort of small potatoes. I mean, do you agree with that assessment? Have we not yet seen kind of large scale deployment of the cyber aspect of Russian capability?
So I agree with that assessment. I certainly agree with that assessment, just based on a capability standpoint, for a lot of reasons, which I'm not going to go into here. But suffice it to say that the capabilities we have observed Russia deploy over the past, really over the past 10 years, but certainly more recently over the past 5 years, I would say, and specifically using Ukraine as kind of its test bed, including NotPetya, Destroyer was another one, Olympic Destroyer. Well, you take these capabilities and you combine them with the access operations that we've seen the Russians execute. And the one that most notably comes to mind is Sunburst, the compromise of the SolarWinds Orion software. That indicates that the Russians have the ability to take this to the next level and utilize the access that they have developed and employ the types of capabilities that we've seen in Ukraine, that we've seen previously, and really have devastating consequences. But that said, Russia has so far restrained itself, and we haven't seen that type of activity, which to a degree is certainly a good thing. Obviously, it's a good thing. But at the same time, it shows that there is an escalation in cyberspace that is possible should Russian leadership choose to take that stance.
You just recently on your LinkedIn, you posted an article from Harvard Business Review, and they talked about, very real potential for this conflict becoming global, at least in the cyber domain. And they cite in that article, they mentioned NotPetya, which you mentioned a couple times, right? That was a targeted attack from Russia to the Ukraine that ended up having a huge spillover effect, whether it was intended or not. Maybe not, probably not that intentional actually, but at the time, and perhaps still today, that had the largest documented economic impact of any single attack. It was like $850 million. So, and since that attack, we've seen other attacks, Colonial Pipeline and others. So, I mean, you mentioned the capabilities there for sure. And so if you combine capability and intent with this idea that significant spillover and collateral damage could happen, we could see something pretty impactful, even if Russia doesn't bring it to our doorstep themselves intentionally.
I think that's a great point, and I think it's something that's important. One, I got to correct you on this one though. So 850 million, I think that was just in the US. So NotPetya writ large, we're talking, I think the figure is over 10 billion worth worldwide. And it was hands down the single largest event. But it hit everything from Maersk shipping to Oreos. I mean, there was a significant swath of companies that were swept up in that.
And that could have been just a US number. Again, given we weren't even a target.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Ukrainian accounting software. How much of that do we have in the US? Apparently a lot if we got $150 million in damage.
Well, in that case, and I don't know whether or not the Sandworm team was the one who executed NotPetya. I'm not sure that the Sandworm team intended for it to spill out of Ukraine. Probably for the same reason what you just said. Like how many companies do you really think are using the Ukrainian attack software? Well, every company that does business in Ukraine, it turns out. So yeah, I think that that may have been unintentional. I don't know for sure, but that being said, it's likely that the Russians have learned from that. They certainly possess the capability. It's likely that they learned how to be a little bit more targeted, and probably are not going to use the same type of autonomous malware that NotPetya was a multi-partite autonomous worm and ransomware combination. They're probably going to be a little bit more. They're probably going to have a little bit more control in the future, just given the type of blowback that they got from that. But that being said, you brought up two different things, and so NotPetya and that type of nation state capability. Obviously, the Russians have demonstrated that. And that is certainly a tool that they have in their arsenal. And it's something that, from both a targeted perspective, just being able to keep it within Ukraine's border, going after Ukrainian critical infrastructure to inflict damage on the Ukrainian population. 100% they can do that. They've demonstrated it. But that same type of capability can be used worldwide, and not necessarily in the same sense as NotPetya, where it was blanket all companies doing business with Ukraine, but it could certainly go after specific critical infrastructure within Europe, within NATO countries, and within the United States. You also brought up ransomware. Ransomware is something that's different and something that has evolved significantly since NotPetya certainly, but since the first Russian invasion of Ukraine. Ransomware is kind of the wild card. Now, ransomware, we in the West, given our legal system, we don't treat ransomware actors necessarily as state-sponsored actors, unless there is a definitive tie. And that tie really has not been made yet. And so they had a level of complexity because that relationship between nation states and ransomware actors and the degree of autonomy that those ransomware actors have is relatively unknown. And so the shift to ransomware as a service and the ease with which relatively unsophisticated criminal actors can access very high level and sophisticated tools, it presents a significant risk to both the private sector and the national security, because should the tie between ransomware actors and these groups and the Russian government prove to be a lot closer than we think, that could be a proxy force, that could be a tool of the Russian government to utilize the access that they've developed and really utilize this proxy force to target critical infrastructure in the private sector across the US and across NATO.
Last time you joined us on this series was back in November. You talked about sort of cyber privateering, right? So that's this notion that these non-state actors, the ransomware gangs, at least have impunity in some places and maybe some support, and maybe that tie could get tighter. Maybe it's tighter than we know. I mean, interestingly, right after the Ukraine campaign started, we've seen a couple of ransomware gangs that have kind of distanced themselves from the Russian government. And I think it's just a financial interest, right? That they're afraid their victims might be less likely to pay the ransom if they think they're paying the Russian government at a time when, you know, the Russian government's doing very unpopular, aggressive acts. So these guys are like, hey, we got to protect our cash flow by saying we don't like the Russians that much anymore. But I suspect that they, you know, that relationship is more complex than we know. And you know, cash flow could come from the Russian government as well as from their ransomware victims, depending on how that lashes up. So you make a good point there. I mean, do you think that's just posturing by those gangs? I mean, what do you think is really behind them sort of taking public stances? And we saw them take a stance where they supported Russian government, they got some blowback, they backed it off, they walked it back. I mean, what's behind that, do you think?
So the one you're talking about specifically is the Conti ransomware group.
Okay.
Yeah, where they posted allegiance to Russia, effectively saying that anyone who is targeting Russia, we will deem an enemy, something to that effect, and that they'll go after him. Very quickly they walked that back and they said, we have no allegiance, we ally ourselves with no government, and we hope for a rapid, a quick end to the war in Ukraine. Stating in effect that the group wasn't aligned to any government, they weren't aligned to Russia.
Right.
Well,
and another one came out and said that, hey, well, all we want to do is our harmless work of extorting people's money. That's all we want.
Yeah, we don't want to harm anybody. We just want to take
no harm, just steal their money.
Yeah, I mean, and with Conti in particular, we saw the result was it wasn't necessarily government actors. Instead, by aligning themselves with Russia, they made themselves a target for this grassroots hacktivist movement that we've seen really spring up, which is a very new facet of warfare. And it would take another half hour to discuss that aspect of it. But you have an unidentified actor compromise and leak all the internal communications within Conti, and there's been a pretty significant impact to the group itself just by having that leak. If you're looking for a really good write-up of the leaks, Krebs on Security covers down on that extremely well. I'd highly recommend taking a look at that. But I think these groups recognize that there's a sweet spot in which they can operate that's not going to draw the full force of law enforcement in the international community and military and intelligence services, where they can, as you said, they can just do their harmless extortion and criminal activity. But once they stray outside of that sweet spot and they start aligning themselves with government or even have that indication, they open themselves up to nation state level response, but also to other groups that aren't necessarily in agreement with the government that they are posing or they're pledging allegiance to. And I think a great example of the nation state reaction to ransomware is the REvil ransomware group, and the way in which the US government, the FBI partners, and also the Russian government went after and dismantled the REvil group. That I think serves as a stark reminder to these groups that once you stray out of that sweet spot, that it really does put you in danger.
Got it. Audience question, is it true that Moscow has banned all Facebook and foreign access to the internet for their civilians? Do you know?
I've seen that on open source. And I think NetBlocks, if you're familiar with NetBlocks reported that as well, that they are blocking a lot of the foreign social media. The idea there is the Russian government, I believe, are recognizing the fact that they are losing the information campaign, and where they can control it because they've lost control of the information environment in the international sphere and on the international stage. Well, they can still control it within the Russian border, and I think that's where their next fight is going to be: is to try to maintain power within their own country and control the information environment and control the conversation.
Yeah, I read this morning that BBC and some other, more global press have been either kicked out or have left. I wasn't sure which of those was happening. So definitely trying to control that. Let me shift gears a little bit. So one of the things that CISA recommends in the Shields Up we talked about earlier is sharing any sign of malicious activity, even if you're successfully blocking it. In other words, even if you didn't have a breach or an incident, but reporting that to CISA and FBI. The administration, the Biden administration has been encouraging transparency and sharing, kind of part of the story that's been coming out. what's in it for companies? Why should they share with the government? What's the motivation to share that kind of detail?
Yeah, I love that question. It's always the whiff 'em. What's in it for me? I truthfully at this time, again, I come back to the inflection point. I think companies are starting to see the fruits of their labor when it comes to information sharing, and that's whether they realize it or not. For instance, last week, CISA added, I think, 95 additional vulnerabilities to its known previously exploited vulnerability catalog. These directly enable net defenders to better secure their networks and defend their assets. And so those vulnerabilities, they come from the private sector. It's not CISA analysts that are going out and identifying these unilaterally. This is coming from cybersecurity vendors. This is coming from Microsoft, from ISPs, but also from individual companies that are reporting these compromises and reporting the things that they're seeing. And it really all feeds back into that. But beyond that, US law really does restrict what the government can do, and it's for good reason. You know, there's this little thing called the Fourth Amendment that restricts what the government can do, but there's also posse comitatus, there's the Wiretap Act, there's the Stored Communications Act, there's intelligence oversight policies, amongst many others, and all of those are aimed at preventing the federal government from overstepping and from conducting what would be collection activities against US persons. Now, that is a great thing. From a privacy perspective, we absolutely need to do that and keeps the government in check. But the unintended consequence of that is it prevents the federal government from seeing the dots, let alone being able to connect them. The private sector sharing of information with the government, it allows organizations like CISA, like US Cyber Command, like the NSA, like the FBI, it allows us access to the information that otherwise we wouldn't be able to access for statutory reasons. But that information is critical to defending the nation. I mean, if you are entirely reliant on overseas collections and the activity that you're seeing cross foreign networks, you're not seeing just half of the threat or half of the problem. You're looking at it through a soda straw. And so that information is absolutely crucial to the government being able to support the private sector and to help secure the domestic networks.
And I think that kind of voluntary sharing, there's a lot of companies that want to do it. I think the opening up some easier pipelines for that would be a worthwhile aspect, right? Right now, it's I think a lot of companies may not even know how to report. Is it email, CISA, FBI? They mentioned both in there, right? So. But I think really getting that to be more of a pipeline of information that people could voluntarily contribute to would be cool. Besides that sort of rapid reporting, what else should be getting attention right now from companies out there that are trying to put their shields up, right? If they're taking that advice, what should they be doing other than that?
Yeah, and rapid reporting is absolutely critical to collective defense, and I actually think that bears repeating. Rapid reporting is critical to collective defense. I mean, for the government to be able to do anything, the government needs to have the information. And it doesn't necessarily mean all the information, but certainly the information that's going to help to identify those indicators of compromise, the signatures, the TTPs of these actors. It's important for private sector to know who to report to. And so if you're in a specific sector, like the DIB is a great example, it's the DoD Cybercrime Center, and they're going to coordinate with CISA. If you're in other sectors, there are other reporting requirements, but it's incumbent upon the company to understand what sector they're in and what the reporting requirements are, or not even requirement, but from a voluntary perspective, who is it best to vector your information or your breach report to? Many organizations, we've talked a lot about CMC, just in general. You and I have talked about that a lot in the past. And a lot of organizations protest the requirements of CMMC, but in the end, the goal is to ensure adherence to the NIST standards. And the DoD through the CMMC is seeking to establish a baseline level of security for its defense supply chain. And so companies, if you're looking to secure and looking for a checklist, the NIST 800 TAC 171 and 172, those standards serve as that checklist for what companies should be doing on a regular basis. And if you're a small business, you may not have the requisite workforce to do that. And so a managed cybersecurity solution is a great option for that kind of thing.
I certainly agree. That's our business. But I think let me beat on the rapid reporting drum a little harder, because I think if you look at the reporting requirements that are out there today, it's breach, right? It's incident. and there's 72 hours within DoD to report a breach, and they have a very specific definition in the DFAR 7012 clause. And I think most people peg that in their incident response plan. They peg to that. When I have to report, I do, because I'm, regulatory requirement to do so. But what CISA guidance, the Shields Up guidance, is changing the game and saying, even if you successfully defend against this attack and don't have an incident, don't have a breach, we still want you to report it. So it's voluntary at that point. That's a big shift for a lot of companies. I don't know a lot of companies that are reporting things that are happening on their network other than incidents and breaches, right? But attempted attacks, there's some valuable information there. And this is the first time I've seen them really ask for it straight up, for people to send that in, even in a case of an unsuccessful attack.
Yeah, but in a lot of cases, that's going to be a full-time job. I mean, there are companies that are getting hit, hundreds and thousands of times per day. You look at a company like Boeing or Lockheed Martin. If they had to report every single time that somebody scanned their network or somebody tried to there was a phishing email, they would be doing nothing but reporting. And so that is a significant ask. But at the same time, how else is the government going to understand what the threat vector is? And you look at something as widespread, and SolarWinds is another good example, but you look at something as widespread as SolarWinds, where that came in through a software update. Well, fortunately, FireEye was the one who identified it. But what if it was, a handful of companies, each of which said, this is an anomaly, this isn't something we need to report? Well, if nobody's able to see the macro, nobody can connect the dots. And so it's an onerous request by CISA, but it does have value.
It's onerous while it's still manual. That's why I was mentioning earlier, getting a pipeline open. Audience member asked, is there a rapid reporting portal? Like, do we even have an automated way to send this stuff in? I mean, technically, I guess you could automate the email sending so that every time you get a detection on your SIM tool, it could kick out an email. But now you're spamming the FBI with, as you say, thousands a day. So some kind of automated pipeline where we could share that level of detail, if for folks that want to, could share that level of detail in a way that's consumable, even in large volumes, right? Even in thousands per day, into a system that could aggregate it. And that's not something they could stand up tomorrow, I'm sure, but it seemed like there's some value there of sort of mass aggregation of attack data across the whole of US.
Absolutely. And I think that would be a great solution. The problem that you're going to run into is the data tagging and standards, because every company that has their own network and every service provider, they're going to tag data a little bit differently. And so we need to come up with a solution that brings it all in and aggregates it in such a way that you're taking different data streams that has information tagged in different ways, such that it can be machine readable and then searchable. And we can apply AI to it to look for those large scale trends. But I think that would be a tremendous solution. The question would then become, where does it sit? Is that a CISA? Is that a program that CISA runs? Is that something that the intelligence community should run? And I think that would end up being a knife fight at the federal level. But that being said, we are in a position right now, with it being at this inflection point. I don't think there are any bad ideas necessarily. And I think if you have strong leadership who is very involved and invested, that you can have that type of significant change, kind of the cybersecurity moonshot that we really do need in order to best secure our collective cybersecurity.
Agree. And one of the audience members suggests we use XML to solve the interoperability challenge. So I think we wish it was quite that easy. We just agree here between us, we're going to use XML and just plug it all in. I think that would be awesome. Probably going to take more than that, I think. But good. Hey, we are at the end of our time. I want to just ask you maybe a closing question. Everybody in the audience, certainly we're all watching the current events. We're all watching what's unfolding, and you've illuminated some of the risks and threats today. What's your advice to our audience today for those that want to take action in response to some of these threats? What's the best things you can do right now in terms of effective action? We talked about rapid reporting. What else is actions today?
Honestly, rapid reporting is the one from a government perspective. That's how you get information into. I'm going to triple down on that because But honestly, it's funny how crises in general just bring us together. Over the past few weeks, I've seen a tremendous amount of information sharing amongst and between federal agencies and with the private sector. These iron silos of excellence, as I love to call them, they've begun to break down. And we started to see a lot more sharing of information that previously had been restricted or wasn't shared widely. I think that's going to continue as the crisis continues to unfold, because it really has served as a lightning rod. I mean, even Congress is coming together for bipartisan agreement on cybersecurity issues and legislation. I think companies, DIB companies in particular, need to recognize that they are an absolutely integral part of national security and national defense, and they need to take that responsibility seriously and share information, report breaches, and secure their networks. Follow the NIST guidance.
That's really good. I appreciate it. Thank you very much. Thanks to you for joining us today, Michael, and to our audience, to Wade Forbes, who's been drawing in the background. We'll send that out. Please do join us for future town hall meetings. Our next session is going to be on the next Wednesday. My date fell off my screen. 16th. I lost it. Yeah, the 16th of March. At our usual time of 1 p.m. Eastern. If you don't have the invitation in registration information in your inbox, please visit our website, neosystemscorp.com, for those details. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.